My name is Elias Whitfield, and for 41 years I made my living making sure other people's houses didn't kill them. That's the plain truth of being an electrician, even if nobody puts it that way. You run the wires so a family can turn on a light switch without thinking twice about it, so they can plug in a coffee maker on a Sunday morning and never once wonder if the walls around them are safe. I like that kind of work. It was quiet, honest, land. And when you did it right, nobody ever noticed you'd done anything at all. That's the best kind of job there is, if you ask me. The kind where your work disappears into somebody else's ordinary life. I retired 7 years ago, and my wife Margaret passed 6 years after that, which means I've spent the better part of a year now living alone in the same house we raised our son in, out past the edge of town where the streets still have more gravel than pavement. I won't pretend that house is quiet in a peaceful way. Some nights it's just quiet in a way that sits heavy on your chest. But I keep busy. I still do small jobs for neighbors when they ask, rewiring a lamp, fixing an outlet that's gone bad, lie. Mostly because my hands don't know how to sit still after 4 decades of using them for something. And I still have my toolbox, the same steel one I bought back in 1984, dented on one corner from a job that went sideways in a basement in Norwood. That box has outlasted 3 trucks and 1 marriage-ending argument with my son. Not until later. Not until things got a lot worse before they got better. I raised 1 son, Corey, and I'll tell you honestly, I wasn't always the father he needed. When he was young, I worked long hours, and Margaret carried more of the weight at home than I ever gave her credit for at the time. Corey struggled some in his 20s. Nothing I want to get into all at once, but let's just say there were a few years where I worried about him in ways a father shouldn't have to. We got through it. He married a good woman, Sandra, steady and warm in the way some people just are without trying. And together they gave me the best gift a grandfather could ask for, a boy named Tyler. Tyler is 22 now, though in my head he's still about 8 years old, riding on my shoulders at the county fair, asking me 100 questions about how electricity travels through a wire. He used to sit in my garage for hours while I worked, handing me tools before I even asked for them, memorizing the names of things most kids his age never think twice about. When Corey was going through his rough patch, it was me and Tyler who got closer maybe, than a grandfather and grandson usually get. I taught him things his father didn't have the patience to teach him back then. He calls me most Sundays, sometimes just to talk about nothing in particular, and I've come to treasure those calls more than I probably let on. I mention all this because you need to understand what kind of trust we're talking about here. The kind that gets built over 22 years, 1 Sunday phone call at a time. That trust is exactly what made what happened to me possible. If you'd asked me a month ago whether anyone could fool me into believing something that wasn't true, I would have laughed. I spent my whole working life learning to notice things other people missed. A loose wire, a spark that shouldn't be there, a smell that meant trouble was coming. I trusted my instincts. I still do, mostly. But instincts are built on patterns, And what happened to me on that Tuesday evening didn't follow any pattern I'd ever learned to recognize. I'd noticed something with Corey in the weeks before all this happened, though I didn't think much of it at the time. He'd canceled 2 Sunday dinners in a row, which wasn't like him. When I asked if everything was all right, he brushed it off, said work was busy, said money was tight, but nothing to worry about. There was an edge in his voice I hadn't heard before, something tight and tired underneath the words. Sandra mentioned once, almost in passing, that he'd been staying up late on his phone, quiet about it, closing the screen quick if she walked into the room. I filed all of it away the way you file away small things, telling myself it was nothing, telling myself my son was a grown man entitled to his privacy. Looking back now, I understand that I was seeing pieces of something, without any idea yet what the whole picture would turn out to be. That Tuesday started like any other. I'd spent the afternoon replacing a ceiling fan for my neighbor, Walt Hendricks, an easy job, the kind I could do with my eyes closed. I came home, heated up leftover stew, and sat in my recliner watching the evening news the way I do most nights, more out of habit than genuine interest. The house was quiet in that familiar way, the kind of quiet I'd learned to live inside of. I had no reason to think that evening would be any different from 1,000 others just like it. I remember looking at my old wall phone, the one still hanging in the kitchen from years back. More decoration than function these days since everyone calls my cell now. I remember thinking, not for the first time, that Margaret always said that phone would outlive us both. Then, a little after 7 o'clock, my cell phone rang. I picked it up without looking at the screen, the way you do when you're not expecting trouble, and I heard my grandson's voice come through, and it stopped my heart cold. It wasn't just his voice, it was Tyler, exactly the way Tyler sounds when something's gone wrong, cracked and fast and breathless, the kind of voice a kid uses when he's scared and doesn't want to be. He said, "Grandpa," and then nothing for a second, just ragged breathing, and my whole body went tight in the chair. "Tyler, what's wrong, son? Talk to me." "I got into an accident, Grandpa. It's bad. I think I hit somebody. There's a cop here. They're saying I have to go to the station. They're saying I need bail. I don't know what to do." His words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other the way they used to when he was a boy and had broken something in the garage and was trying to explain it before I could get angry. "Please, please don't tell Dad. He's going to kill me. Just please, can you help me? I need $11,000. Or they're not going to let me go tonight. I'm so scared, Grandpa. I want you to understand something. I have heard my grandson's voice thousands of times across 22 years. I know the exact way he laughs when he's trying not to. I know the exact way his voice breaks when he's genuinely frightened, because I heard it once when he was 12 and got lost at a state fair for 40 minutes that felt like 40 years. What came through that phone was not a stranger doing an impression. It was him. Every catch in his throat, every stammer, every tiny detail that makes a voice belong to one specific person and nobody else on earth. I didn't have 1 second of doubt. Not one. "Tell me what to do," I said, already up out of my chair, already moving toward the kitchen table, where I kept my checkbook and my banking information. "I'm here, Tyler. I'm not going anywhere. Just tell me what you need." A man's voice came on then, calm, official sounding, introducing himself as a bail processing officer, rattling off a case number, telling me the process needed to move quickly, that wire transfers were the only way to get things handled before the courthouse closed processing for the night. He gave me an account number. He gave me a routing number. He spoke with the kind of bored efficiency you'd expect from someone who did this exact thing 40 times a day, which, in a way I wouldn't understand until much later, he probably did. I wrote everything down with a shaking hand, my reading glasses sliding down my nose, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I didn't call Corey. I didn't call Sandra. Tyler had begged me not to, and in the moment, protecting him from his father's temper felt like the single most important thing I could do with what remained of that night. I drove myself to the bank branch that stays open late on Tuesdays for exactly this kind of emergency, or so I thought, and I wired $11,000 of my retirement savings to an account I had never heard of for a grandson who I believed, with everything in me, was sitting in a holding cell somewhere scared out of his mind. The teller, a young woman I didn't recognize, asked me twice if I was certain about the transfer amount. I told her yes. I remember feeling almost proud of myself in that moment. Useful, needed, the kind of grandfather who shows up when it matters. 41 years of fixing things with my hands, and here I was fixing something with what was left of my savings instead. And it felt, God help me, like exactly the right thing to do. I drove home a little after 8, running through what I'd say to Corey once Tyler was safe, rehearsing how I'd explained keeping this from him, how I'd frame it as protecting his son rather than deceiving him. I sat back down in my recliner, still shaking a little, waiting for a call, telling me Tyler had been released, that he was safe, that everything had worked out the way these things are supposed to when a family pulls together. My phone rang again at 8:41. It was Tyler. His voice this time was easy, normal, a little tired from a long shift at the hardware store where he'd been working the evening register. He was calling, same as most Tuesdays, just to tell me about a customer who'd tried to return a lawnmower he'd clearly run over a fence with. There was no accident in his voice, no fear, no courthouse, no bail. I sat very still in that recliner, holding the phone against my ear, and for a long moment I couldn't make a single word come out of my mouth. Tyler kept talking, easy and unaware, until something in my silence finally reached him, and he stopped mid-sentence and said, "Grandpa, you okay? You sound weird," I asked him, in a voice that didn't sound like my own, whether he'd called me a little after 7 that evening. He said no. He said he'd been at work since 5. I asked him if he was certain, and I heard the confusion creeping into his voice now, the same confusion that was spreading through my own chest like ice water. That was the moment the floor went out from under me. Not the moment I wired the money, not even close. This was worse, because if that hadn't been Tyler on the phone an hour and a half earlier, shaking and scared and begging me not to tell his father, then whoever it was had known things about my family that no stranger should have ever known. And somewhere underneath the panic rising in my chest, a colder thought was already starting to form. One I wasn't ready to look at directly yet. Whoever had done this hadn't guessed at those details. They had known them, which meant somehow this hadn't started with a stranger at all. He didn't sleep that night, not really. I sat at my kitchen table with the lights off, running the call back over and over in my head, trying to find the seam where the lie had shown itself, and finding nothing. Every detail had been right, the catch in his voice when he was scared. The exact way he says grandpa and not grandpa, the way some kids drag it out lazy, but quick and clipped, the way Tyler always has since he was small. Whoever had done this hadn't just copied a voice. They had copied a person down to the smallest, most private habits of speech that only someone who truly knew him would recognize. That thought sat in my chest all night like a stone. First thing the next morning, I called the police non-emergency line and drove down to the station myself because some things you need to say to a person's face, not into a phone. That's where I met Detective Rosa Mendez-Patel, a woman maybe in her 40s, with tired eyes and a manner about her that told me right away she'd heard a version of my story before more times than she probably wanted to count. Why? She sat me down in a small office that smelled like burnt coffee and listened to the whole thing without interrupting once, taking notes in handwriting I couldn't begin to read upside down. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes for a second before she spoke. Mr. Whitfield, I'm very sorry this happened to you, and I want you to know first, this is not your fault. What you're describing has a name. It's called voice cloning fraud, and it's become a lot more common in the last couple years than most people realize. There's software now, some of it free, that can take just a few seconds of a person's voice off a social media video, a voicemail greeting, doesn't take much, and build a convincing copy of it. Convincing enough to fool even the people who know that voice best. I remember feeling something between relief and horror at hearing that. Relief because it meant I hadn't simply lost my mind, hadn't failed some basic test of judgment I should have passed. Horror because it meant the voice I'd heard, shaking and desperate and begging me not to tell his father, had been manufactured, assembled, built specifically to break through my defenses in a way nothing else could have. Can you trace where the money went? I asked her. Can you get it back? She was honest with me, which I respected even as it landed like a blow. We'll try. Lie. I won't lie to you and tell you it's likely. These wire transfers usually move through a chain of accounts fast, sometimes converted to something harder to trace within hours. The phone number that called you was almost certainly spoofed, routed through a voice-over internet service that won't have a real address behind it. I've worked 4 cases like this in the last year alone, and I've recovered funds in exactly one of them. I sat with that for a moment, feeling the weight of $11,000 settle somewhere behind my ribs, money I'd spent 41 years earning with my hands, gone in the space of 20 minutes to someone I would probably never see punished for it. But something else was bothering me more than the money, something I couldn't quite put into words until Mendez-Patel said it for me. There's one thing that concerns me more than the technology, honestly, she said, flipping back through her notes. The details. The accident excuse, sure, that's standard. They use that one constantly because it triggers panic fast. But asking specifically not to tell his father, knowing to call you instead of Corey or Sandra, that's not something these scam operations usually know. Most of the time, they're working off scraped information, a name here, a relationship there, pieced together from social media. This felt more specific than that, more personal. I asked her what she meant, and she chose her words carefully, the way people do when they're about to say something they know will hurt. I mean, Mr. Whitfield, that in most of these cases, the victim is a stranger to the scammer beyond what they can find online. But the details you're describing, the family dynamics, who to call, who not to tell, that level of specificity usually points to a more direct source. I'm not saying that's the case here. I'm saying it's worth considering as we move forward whether someone close to your family might have unknowingly or knowingly provided information that made this attack possible. I didn't want to hear that. I told her as much, a little more sharply than I intended, and she didn't push back, just let the silence sit there while I worked through it myself. Because the truth was, some small, ugly part of my mind had already started turning that idea over before she ever said it out loud, and I hated that it had. I thought about Corey's canceled dinners. I thought about Sandra mentioning he'd been quiet on his phone at odd hours. I told myself I was being unfair, that grief and shock were making me suspicious of people who didn't deserve it, and I left that station determined to find the truth some other way, one that didn't start with doubting my own son. I called Tyler that evening and asked if he'd come by the house that weekend. I told him I needed his help with something, which wasn't exactly a lie. What I didn't tell him yet was that I intended for the two of us to sit down and figure out, detail by lie, exactly how much a stranger could have possibly known about our family, and how much they couldn't have. I had a feeling, sitting there in my quiet kitchen with the wall phone hanging silent above the counter, that the answer to that question was going to lead somewhere. I very much did not want to go. Tyler showed up that Saturday morning with 2 coffees and the same easy grin he's had since he was a boy, though I could see the concern underneath it, the way he kept glancing at me sideways like he was checking to make sure I hadn't aged 10 years overnight. In a way, I suppose I had. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one Margaret used to set for Sunday dinners, and I laid out for him everything the scammer had said on that call, word for word as best as I could remember it, while he listened with his jaw getting tighter by the minute. Walk me through exactly what he said, Grandpa. Every detail you can remember. I told him about the accident story, the fear in the voice, the plea not to tell his father. Then I mentioned something that had been nagging at me since that night, something I hadn't fully registered until I said it out loud. He called you, Ty said. Not Tyler. Ty. Begged me not to tell his dad, said it just like that, quick, like it was nothing. Tyler went very still across the table. Grandpa, almost nobody calls me Ty. You do. Grandma used to. My buddies from high school, maybe. My dad's never called me that in his life. He thinks it sounds like a kid's nickname. He's told me that more than once. He pulled his phone out and started scrolling, thinking out loud the way he does. The same way he used to talk through a broken bike chain when he was 10. Okay, so if it's not something scraped off Instagram, where would somebody even get that? I don't post much, and what I do post, I don't think I've ever used that nickname online, not once. We spent the better part of 2 hours going piece by piece through everything the caller had used against me. The nickname was one thing, but there was more details I hadn't even fully processed as strange until we started laying them out side by side like puzzle pieces on the table. The caller had mentioned in passing a fender bender Tyler had actually been in 8 months earlier. A real one, minor, no injuries, resolved quietly between insurance companies without ever going anywhere near a courthouse. It was the kind of thing that had happened once briefly and been forgotten by everyone, except the people who'd been directly involved or told about it afterward. I told my parents about that accident, Tyler said slowly. And I think I mentioned it to you, right? But I never posted about it anywhere. There's no record of it online that a stranger could just stumble across. I felt something cold settle into my stomach as the picture started narrowing itself down to an uncomfortably small circle of people. The caller had also known, somehow, that I take blood pressure medication every morning with breakfast, the detail the fake bail officer had used almost casually, telling me not to let the stress of the situation affect my health, an oddly personal touch dressed up as concern. That wasn't something anyone posts online. That was something only someone who'd sat across a breakfast table from me would know. Tyler got up and walked over to the refrigerator, where a photo had hung for years, the whole family crowded together at Tyler's high school graduation, and on the back of it, in Margaret's careful handwriting, she'd once written everyone's birthdays so she'd never forget an anniversary or a special date again. It was such an old habit of hers, one I'd never thought to take down after she passed, a small piece of her still hanging there, doing exactly what she'd meant it to do. Grandpa, does anybody outside the family know this photo exists? Know what's written on the back of it? I told him no, not that I could think of. Sandra knew. Tyler himself knew, obviously. Beyond the 4 of us, I couldn't imagine who else would have ever seen it, let alone remembered what was written there. We sat with that for a long moment, the coffee going cold between us, both of us circling the same uncomfortable conclusion without either one of us willing to say it first. Finally, Tyler said it plainly in the careful, gentle way he's always had about him, even as a kid. Grandpa, I don't think this was some random scam. I think whoever set this up knew things about our family that basically nobody outside of us 4 would know. And I really don't want to say what I'm thinking right now because it feels wrong even thinking it. I told him I understood because I'd been circling that same thought myself since my conversation with Detective Mendez Patel, turning it over at 3 a.m, hating every version of it. I asked him not to say it yet either, not out loud, lie. Not until we had something more solid than a bad feeling and a handful of coincidences. But I could feel the direction of things shifting underneath us, the way you can feel a structure starting to lean before it actually falls. Some part of me already knew where this was heading, even as I kept telling myself I was wrong, that I had to be wrong, that there was still some other explanation waiting to be found. Before Tyler left that afternoon, he asked me something that stuck with me for days afterward. Grandpa, has Dad been acting weird lately? Like off, distracted, anything like that? I thought about the canceled dinners, the edge in Corey's voice, Sandra mentioning the late nights on his phone, the screen closing quick whenever she walked into the room. I told Tyler the truth because there wasn't any use lying to him at that point, not with both of us already thinking the same unspoken thing. Yeah, I said. He has. Tyler showed up that Saturday morning with 2 coffees and the same easy grin he's had since he was a boy, though I could see the concern underneath it. The way he kept glancing at me sideways like he was checking to make sure I hadn't aged 10 years overnight. In a way, I suppose I had. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one Margaret used to set for Sunday dinners, and I laid out for him everything the scammer had said on that call, word for word as best as I could remember it, while he listened with his jaw getting tighter by the minute. Walk me through exactly what he said, Grandpa, every detail you can remember. I told him about the accident story, the fear in the voice, the plea not to tell his father. Then I mentioned something that had been nagging at me since that night, something I hadn't fully registered until I said it out loud. He called you Ty, I said, not Tyler. Ty begged me not to tell his dad, said it just like that, quick, like it was nothing. Tyler went very still across the table. Grandpa, almost nobody calls me Ty. You do. Grandma used to. My buddies from high school, maybe. My dad's never called me that in his life. He thinks it sounds like a kid's nickname. He's told me that more than once. He pulled his phone out and started scrolling, thinking out loud the way he does, the same way he used to talk through a broken bike chain when he was 10. Okay, so if it's not something scraped off Instagram, where would somebody even get that? I don't post much, and what I do post, I don't think I've ever used that nickname online, not once. We spent the better part of 2 hours going piece by piece through everything the caller had used against me. The nickname was one thing, but there was more details I hadn't even fully processed as strange until we started laying them out side by side like puzzle pieces on the table. The caller had mentioned, in passing, a fender bender Tyler had actually been in 8 months earlier, a real one, minor, no injuries, resolved quietly between insurance companies without ever going anywhere near a courthouse. It was the kind of thing that had happened once, briefly, and been forgotten by everyone except the people who'd been directly involved or told about it afterward. I told my parents about that accident, Tyler, and I think I mentioned it to you, right? But I never posted about it anywhere. There's no record of it online that a stranger could just stumble across. Lie. I felt something cold settle into my stomach as the picture started narrowing itself down to an uncomfortably small circle of people. The caller had also known, somehow, that I take blood pressure medication every morning with breakfast, a detail the fake bail officer had used almost casually, telling me not to let the stress of the situation affect my health, an oddly personal touch dressed up as concern. That wasn't something anyone posts online. That was something only someone who'd sat across a breakfast table from me would know. Tyler got up and walked over to the refrigerator, where a photo had hung for years, the whole family crowded together, at Tyler's high school graduation, and on the back of it, in Margaret's careful handwriting, she'd once written everyone's birthday so she'd never forget an anniversary or a special date again. It was such an old habit of hers, one I'd never thought to take down after she passed. A small piece of her still hanging there, doing exactly what she'd meant it to do. Grandpa, does anybody outside the family know this photo exists? Know what's written on the back of it? I told him no, not that I could think of. Sandra knew. Corey knew. Lie. Tyler himself knew, obviously. Beyond the 4 of us, I couldn't imagine who else would have ever seen it, let alone remembered what was written there. We sat with that for a long moment, the coffee going cold between us, both of us circling the same uncomfortable conclusion without either one of us willing to say it first. Finally, Tyler said it plainly, in the careful, gentle way he's always had about him, even as a kid. Grandpa, I don't think this was some random scam, I think whoever set this up knew things about our family that basically nobody outside of us 4 would know. And I really don't want to say what I'm thinking right now, because it feels wrong even thinking it. I told him I understood, because I'd been circling that same thought myself since my conversation with Detective Mendez Patel. turning it over at 3 in the morning, hating every version of it. I asked him not to say it yet either, not out loud, not until we had something more solid than a bad feeling and a handful of coincidences. But I could feel the direction of things shifting underneath us, the way you can feel a structure starting to lean before it actually falls. And some part of me already knew where this was heading. Even as I kept telling myself I was wrong, that I had to be wrong, that there was still some other explanation waiting to be found. Before Tyler left that afternoon, he asked me something that stuck with me for days afterward. Grandpa, has Dad been acting weird lately? Like off, distracted, anything like that? I thought about the canceled dinners, the edge in Corey's voice, Sandra mentioning the late nights on his phone, screen closing quick whenever she walked into the room. I told Tyler the truth because there wasn't any use lying to him at that point, not with both of us already thinking the same unspoken thing. Yeah, I said, he has. I want to be honest with you about something, because honesty is the only way through the rest of this. In the days that followed, my mind went first to Sandra, and I'm not proud of that, but I think it's important I tell it the way it actually happened rather than the way I wish it had. Sandra's family lives 2 states over. People I've met maybe a handful of times at holidays and one memorable 4th of July cookout years back. I didn't know them well, and not knowing someone well is a strange kind of soil for suspicion to grow in. I found myself wondering quietly whether one of her relatives could have pieced together enough about our family through casual conversation to make this possible. I mentioned it to Sandra directly because I've never believed in tiptoeing around a person when something serious is at stake, and she deserved to hear it from me rather than sense it secondhand. We sat on her back porch on a Tuesday evening, almost exactly a week after the call, and I laid out my concern as gently as I knew how. Sandra didn't get defensive, which told me something right away. She just looked tired and a little sad, and she said, Elias, I understand why you're asking, and I don't blame you for it. But my family barely knows Tyler's nickname, let alone what medication you take or what's written on the back of a photo on your refrigerator. I don't think it's us. She was right, and I knew it almost as soon as she said it. Her family didn't have that kind of access to the small, quiet details of our daily lives. Whoever had done this had known us the way you only know people you sit across a dinner table with regularly, the way you know people whose habits you've absorbed without ever meaning to memorize them. That conversation didn't clear Sandra so much as it closed a door, and closing that door left only one door remaining, one. I'd been circling for a week without letting myself walk through it, Corey. I didn't want it to be true. I want you to understand that as plainly as I can say it. This is my son, the boy I taught to ride a bike in the same gravel driveway I still park in every day. The boy who cried at his mother's funeral in a way that broke something open in my own chest, watching him grieve. The idea that he could be connected in any way to what had happened to me felt disloyal even to consider, like a betrayal of my own blood before he'd done anything to deserve my suspicion. But I couldn't stop noticing things now that I was finally looking. The canceled dinners, 3 of them by that point, each with a thinner excuse than the last. Lamai. The tightness in his voice whenever money came up, which it hadn't used to, not like this. And then, about 10 days after the scam call, I overheard something I wasn't meant to hear. I'd stopped by his house to drop off a ladder he'd borrowed months earlier. The front door was unlocked the way it usually is on a Saturday afternoon. I let myself in, calling out his name, and I heard his voice coming from the garage, low and strained, clearly on the phone with someone. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I want to be clear about that. But something in his tone made me stop in the hallway before I rounded the corner, some instinct built from 4 decades of listening for the sound of something being wrong. I told you, I can't get you more than that right now. Why? Corey was saying, his voice tight with something between frustration and fear. You said this would be the last time. You said once I gave you what you needed, we'd be square. I've already given you more than I ever should have. I stood frozen in that hallway, my hand still on the ladder, listening to my son's voice crack in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager caught in some lie he couldn't wriggle out of. I didn't understand yet what he meant by what you needed. Didn't have any way to connect it yet to the phone call that had cost me $11,000. In that moment, my mind went to gambling debts, to loan sharks, to the kind of trouble a desperate man gets into when he's drowning and looking for anything solid to grab onto. It never once occurred to me, standing in that hallway, that what you needed he was talking about might have included pieces of his own father's private life. He came around the corner a moment later, and startled hard at the sight of me standing there, his face going through about 3 different expressions before settling on something carefully neutral. Dad? Hey? I didn't hear you come in. Door was open, I said, holding up the ladder like an explanation, like a shield. Just dropping this off. He thanked me, a little too quickly, and I could see him working to steady himself, to fold whatever had just happened on that call back into a version of himself that looked normal. I left without asking him anything more, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to push, to demand an answer right there in his driveway. I told myself I needed to be sure before I said anything that could never be unsaid between us. I told myself I owed him that much, the benefit of the doubt, one more chance to be wrong about him. That night, I called Detective Mendez Patel and asked her, without fully explaining why, whether there was any way to look into financial trouble as a possible piece of this puzzle. She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line before she said carefully, Mr. Whitfield, if there's someone specific you're thinking of, it would help the investigation if you told me now rather than later. I gave her Corey's name. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, harder than any electrical job I ever climbed into, harder than standing at Margaret's graveside. Some part of me kept hoping, even as I said his name out loud to a police detective, that I was about to be proven wrong, but there was some other explanation, waiting just out of reach that would let me put this whole ugly suspicion to rest and go back to believing. My son was simply going through a hard time, nothing more. It took Detective Mendez Patel 5 days to call me back, and those 5 days were some of the longest of my life. I went through my normal routine, fixed a garbage disposal for Mrs. Alvarez 2 streets over, mowed my own lawn twice, even though it didn't need it the second time. Anything to keep my hands busy while my mind kept circling back to that hallway, to Corey's voice cracking on the phone, to the word square hanging in the air like something unfinished. When she finally called, she asked me to come down to the station rather than talk over the phone, which told me before she said a single word that whatever she'd found was serious enough to deliver in person. I drove down that afternoon with my stomach in knots, the same knots I remember having outside a hospital room the day Tyler was born, except this time dread, instead of anticipation, was sitting behind my ribs. She sat me down in that same small office and slid a folder across the desk, though she kept it closed under her hand for a moment before opening it, the way you'd hold back before pulling off a bandage. Mr. Whitfield, I want to walk you through this carefully because it's not simple. I don't want you jumping to the worst possible conclusion before you have the full picture. She opened the folder, get a warrant to look at some financial records connected to your son, based on what you told me. What we found is a pattern of significant losses through several online sports betting platforms, going back about 18 months. The amounts escalated steadily. By 6 months ago, he was into a hole he clearly couldn't climb out of through normal means. I sat with that for a moment, feeling something like relief mixed with a fresh kind of dread. Gambling. That explained the canceled dinners, the tight voice, the late nights on his phone. It was bad, it was serious. But it was also, in some strange way, a version of this story I could understand. One that didn't require me to believe my son had deliberately set out to hurt me. There's more, Mendez Patel said, and something in her voice made my chest tighten again. About 4 months ago, we found records showing Corey was contacted online by an entity presenting itself as a financial recovery service. They offered to help settle his gambling debts in exchange for what they called account verification information. Personal details, family information, that kind of thing, presented to him as a standard part of a debt consolidation process. What kind of information, I asked, though some part of me already knew. Details about close family members, names, relationship, small personal facts that would supposedly be used to verify his identity and set up what he believed was a legitimate financial recovery plan. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Mr. Whitfield, based on the timeline, and based on the specific nature of what was used against you during that scam call, it's our assessment that the information Corey provided to this service was sold or used directly by the same network that targeted you, legally. We believe your son handed over pieces of your private life to people who were never going to help him with anything. We believe he did it without understanding what it would actually be used for. I don't know how long I sat there without saying anything. The office felt very small and very quiet, and I remember staring at a water stain on the ceiling tile above her desk, focusing on it hard, the way you focus on some small, unimportant thing when the big thing in front of you is too heavy to look at directly. My son had handed a stranger the keys to hurt me. Not with malice, not on purpose, but he'd done it. He'd taken money-shaped desperation and traded away pieces of his own father's life to make it stop. And in doing so, he'd built the exact weapon that had been used against me. Is he going to be charged with anything? I finally asked. That's still being determined, she said. Right now, the evidence suggests he was a victim of a secondary scam himself, exploited because of his debt, rather than a knowing participant in defrauding you directly. That matters legally, and I think it should matter to you too as his father. But I won't pretend the outcome is settled yet. There's still an active investigation into the network itself, and depending on what we find, his level of cooperation and honesty going forward is going to matter quite a bit. I drove home that evening in a kind of fog I don't have good words for. Betrayed doesn't quite cover it, because betrayal implies intention, and what I was feeling was something messier than that. Grief tangled up with anger, tangled up with a strange, aching pity for my own son that I hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. I thought about that hallway, about the word square, about how close I'd come to demanding answers right there in his driveway, and how differently that conversation might have gone if I hadn't waited. I sat in my kitchen that night with the lights off again, same as the first night after the scam call, staring at that old wall phone hanging silent above the counter. Margaret used to say that phone would outlive us both, and I found myself wishing foolishly that things were still that simple line you could trust, because you could see exactly where it led and exactly who was on the other end of it. Nothing about this felt that simple anymore. Everything felt like it had two meanings now, one on the surface and one hiding underneath it, and I didn't know yet how I was going to sit across from my son and ask him to explain the second one. I called Sandra first, before I called Corey, because I needed her to understand what was coming before it landed on her doorstep. She was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then she said something that stayed with me. Elias, I think I've known something was wrong for months. I just didn't want to know what. Neither had I, if I'm being honest. But the not knowing was over now, whether either of us wanted it to be or not. And somewhere out there, my son was going to have to sit across from me and explain how his own desperation had turned into the thing that nearly broke his father. I asked Corey to come by the house alone on a Sunday afternoon, telling him only that we needed to talk, nothing more. I didn't want Sandra there, and I didn't want Tyler there either, not for this first conversation. Some things I've come to believe, need to happen between a father and a son with nobody else in the room, even when what's being said is going to change how everyone in the family sees each other afterward. He showed up looking like a man who already knew, in some part of himself, why he'd been called. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where Tyler and I had laid out the pieces of this puzzle weeks earlier, and he couldn't quite meet my eyes, kept turning his coffee mug in small circles without drinking from it. Dad, whatever this is about, I need you to know I know about the gambling, Corey, I said, cutting him off gently but firmly, because I needed him to understand right away that I wasn't there to ease him into a confession he might still try to talk his way around. I know about the debts. And I know about the information you gave to some company that promised to help you settle them. His face went through something then that I'll remember for a long time, a kind of collapse that happened without a single muscle actually moving, like watching a building come down from the inside before the walls ever show a crack. He set the mug down carefully, both hands flat on the table, and when he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than I'd heard it since he was a boy. How much do you know? I know it was your information they used against me on that call. The nickname, the accident, my medication, all of it. I made myself keep my voice level, though it cost me something to do it. I need you to tell me the rest yourself, Corey, not the detective, you. He told me. It came out slow at first, then faster, like something that had been dammed up so long it couldn't help but flood once the first crack appeared. He told me about the betting, how it started small, almost a game, a way to unwind after work, that he told himself he could stop anytime he wanted. He told me how it stopped being fun somewhere along the way and became something he couldn't put down, chasing losses with bigger bets, telling himself the next one would fix everything, until the hole he dug was too deep to climb out of on a salesman's salary without Sandra ever finding out. I was so ashamed, Dad. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell Sandra. I kept thinking I could fix it myself before anyone had to know, and then it just kept getting worse, and I didn't know what else to do. He rubbed a hand hard across his face, and then this company reached out, said They specialized in debt consolidation for guys in exactly my situation. Said they could get my creditors to settle for pennies on the dollar if I just verified some information first. Family details, they standard stuff. Just to prove I was who I said I was. What did you tell them, Corey? Names, relationships. Tyler's nickname, remember them specifically asking for a nickname, said it was for some kind of security question set up. Your medication, because they asked about health considerations for a family hardship provision. Something like that. I didn't think anything of it, Dad. I swear to you, it felt like paperwork. It felt boring and official, not like I was handing anyone a weapon. His voice cracked on that last word, and I watched my grown son's shoulders start to shake. I would never, in 100 years, given anyone anything. If I thought for 1 second it would be used to hurt you. I didn't know, Dad. I didn't know what I was doing. I sat there for a long moment looking at this man who was still somehow also the boy I'd taught to change a tire in this same driveway, and I felt something twist hard in my chest, grief and anger braided together so tight I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. A part of me wanted to reach across that table and pull him into the kind of hug that fixes things. Another part of me, the part still raw from standing in a bank line wiring away $11,000 for a grandson who was never in any danger at all, wanted to ask him how he could have been so careless with the people he claimed to love most. I trusted the wrong people, and it cost you everything. And I will never forgive myself for that, Corey said, and he was crying now, openly, in a way I hadn't seen since Margaret's funeral. I know sorry doesn't fix what I did. I know it doesn't give you that money back. And it doesn't undo what almost happened, or what actually happened to your trust in your own grandson's voice. I just need you to know I never wanted this. Any of it. I reached for my old toolbox instinct in that moment, the part of me that spent 41 years believing there's always a way to fix what's broken if you're patient enough and careful enough with your hands. But sitting across from my son, watching him fall apart at my kitchen table, I understood for the first time in my life that some things don't come with a wiring diagram. Some things you can't just splice back together and expect the current to flow the way it used to. I don't know what I feel right now, Corey. I told him honestly, because pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of lie. I love you. That hasn't changed and it isn't going to change. But I'm angry and I'm hurt. I don't know yet how those two things are supposed to live together in the same house. He nodded, wiping his face, not arguing with me, not trying to talk his way past what he'd done. And in that, at least, I saw something of the man I'd hoped he'd grow into, living. When he left that afternoon, neither of us hugged goodbye the way we usually did. We just stood in the driveway for a moment, two men who loved each other and didn't yet know how to stand on solid ground together again. And then he got in his car and drove away. I went back inside to a house that felt emptier than it had in a long time. The days after that conversation were some of the hardest of the whole ordeal, harder in some ways than the scam call itself, because at least that had come with a clear villain, someone out there who deserved every ounce of my anger without complication. What I carried now didn't have anywhere clean to land. I was angry at my son, and I loved my son, and both of those things sat in my chest at the same time without canceling each other out, and I didn't have the first idea what to do with that. Sandra called me 2 days later, her voice tight in a way I'd never heard from her before. She and Corey had fought badly, the kind of fight that leaves a marriage standing but shaken at its foundation. I don't know if I can trust him right now, Elias, she told me. I could hear she was crying, trying not to let it show in her voice. Not about money, not about anything he's not telling me. He kept this from me for over a year. A year, Elias. I was sleeping 4 feet away from him every night, and I had no idea how deep this had gotten. Tyler took it hard in a different way. He came by the house that weekend, quieter than I'd ever seen him, and he sat on my back porch steps, staring out at the yard for a long while before he finally said what was sitting on his chest. He used my nickname, Grandpa. My own dad handed over the one thing that only people who actually love me would know, and it got used to scare you into thinking I was in trouble. I don't even know how to look at him right now. I didn't have good answers for either of them, because I didn't have good answers for myself. I spent those days doing the only thing I've ever known how to do when a situation gets too big to hold in my hands all at once, which is to keep them busy with something smaller. I reorganized my garage. I replaced every outlet in the house that had been on my list of someday projects for longer than I care to admit. I even took my old toolbox apart piece by piece one evening, cleaning 40 years of grime out of corners I hadn't touched since Reagan was president. And somewhere in the middle of that quiet, repetitive work, I finally let myself think about Margaret. She and I went through our own hard year once, a long time ago, back when Corey was young, and money was tighter than either of us wanted to admit, and we said things to each other we didn't mean. The kind of things that leave marks even after the words themselves are forgotten. I remembered asking her once, in the worst of it, how she managed to keep loving me through a stretch where I wasn't particularly easy to love. She'd told me something I hadn't thought about in years, sitting on the edge of our bed with her hair still damp from the shower, and it came back to me now with a clarity that felt like she was standing right there in the garage with me. She'd said that loving someone through their worst mistake isn't the same as excusing it. She said forgiveness was never supposed to mean pretending something didn't happen or pretending it didn't hurt. It meant deciding on purpose that the relationship mattered more than the debt owed for the damage done, and then doing the harder work of rebuilding trust one honest day at a time instead of either walking away or pretending everything was fine. She'd said that to me on one of the worst nights of our marriage, and somehow it had carried us through into 30 more good years together before cancer took her from me. I sat down on an overturned bucket in that garage and let myself cry for the first time since this whole thing had started. Not for the money, not even really for the fear I'd felt on that phone call, but for the exhausting weight of trying to figure out how to be a father to a grown man who'd hurt me without meaning to, in a way that was going to take a very long time to undo. By the end of that week, I'd made a decision, though it didn't come to me all at once so much as it settled into place slowly, the way concrete sets. I wasn't going to cut Corey off. I wasn't going to pretend this hadn't happened either, or rush him back into easy forgiveness before he'd actually done anything to earn it back. But exile wasn't going to fix what was broken any more than pretending would. My son needed consequences, real ones, consequences with weight and follow-through. Underneath all of that, buried under the debt, the shame, the terrible carelessness with the people he loved, he was still going to need his father to be standing somewhere on the other side of this, waiting for him to climb back. I called him that Sunday evening, the first time either of us had spoken since he'd left my driveway in tears. I told him I wasn't ready to act like nothing had happened, and I wasn't going to pretend the money or the trust could just be handed back overnight. But I also told him I wasn't going anywhere. I told him that if he was serious about fixing this, really fixing it, not just apologizing and hoping time smoothed it over, then I needed to see it in what he did next, not just what he said. I want to help however I can, he said, his voice rough on the other end of the line. Whatever that looks like, Dad, tell me, and I'll do it. I told him I'd think about it, and I did think about it for several more days, turning the shape of a plan over in my mind the same careful way I used to plan out a wiring job before I ever picked up a tool. I wanted restitution that meant something, not just a check written to make the guilt go away. And somewhere in that thinking, an idea started to take shape, one that would ask my son to show up, literally with his hands, the same way I'd spent my whole life showing up for other people with mine. Detective Mendez Patel called about 3 weeks after that conversation in my garage, and this time there was something different in her voice, something closer to satisfaction than the careful caution I'd grown used to hearing from her. Mr. Whitfield wanted you to hear this from me directly. We've made arrests. The network that targeted you, the same one that reached out to Corey with that fake debt consolidation offer, turned out to be a larger operation than we initially realized, running similar scams across 4 states. Your son's information, along with financial records from his case, helped us build enough of a pattern to get warrants that finally cracked it open. I sat with that for a moment, feeling something loosen in my chest that had been wound tight since that Tuesday evening months earlier. What about the money? We were able to freeze several accounts before everything moved further downstream. You won't get the full $11,000 back. I want to be honest about that, but we've recovered a little over $6,000 that will be returned to you through the court process in the coming weeks. It's not everything, but it's more than I usually get to tell people in your situation. It wasn't everything. She was right about that, but it was something, and after the year I'd had, something felt like more than I'd let myself hope for. What mattered more to me, though, was what she said next, almost as an afterthought, though I don't think she meant it that way at all. For what it's worth, Corey's full cooperation made a real difference here. He didn't have to come forward with everything he knew about how he was approached, how the information was requested, the exact platforms involved. He did, and it helped. That matters both for the case and, frankly, for how the DA's office is looking at his level of culpability going forward. I called Corey that same evening to tell him what Mendez Patel had said. I heard something shift in his voice when I did. Something like a man finally allowed to exhale after holding his breath for a very long time. He'd already started, on his own, going to a gambling addiction support group that met twice a week at the community center downtown, something Sandra told me about before he ever mentioned it himself. And I understood that as its own kind of message, a man trying to do the harder, slower work instead of waiting to be told to. The plan I'd been turning over in my mind finally found its shape that week, and I laid it out for Corey plainly. I didn't want to check. I told him that outright. What I wanted was for him to spend his Saturdays with me, for as long as it took, helping me finish the projects around this house that had been sitting on my someday list for years, the gutters that needed replacing, the shed roof that had been leaking since the spring before Margaret passed, the fence along the back property line that had been leaning a little further every winter. I wanted his hands doing honest work alongside mine, the same way I used to imagine, foolishly maybe, that fathers and sons were supposed to work. He showed up that first Saturday morning nervous, in a way I hadn't seen from him since he was a teenager, learning to drive stick in the church parking lot. I handed him a pair of work gloves and put him to work hauling old shingles down off the shed roof. And for the first hour or so, neither of us said much of anything beyond what the job required. But somewhere around the second hour, hauling debris together toward the truck bed, he started talking, quietly at first, about the support group, about a man there named Frank, who'd lost his marriage to the same thing Corey was fighting, and had been sober from gambling for 6 years now, about how strange and humbling it was to sit in a circle of grown men admitting, out loud, how badly they'd let their families down. I didn't say much in response, mostly just listened, the way I used to when he was small and working through some problem out loud that didn't really need my input so much as it needed my presence. But by the end of that first Saturday, something had shifted between us. Not fixed, not anywhere close to fully repaired, but shifted in a direction I could finally recognize as forward instead of just sideways. We kept at it, Saturday after Saturday, through the shed roof and the gutters, and eventually the fence, and somewhere in those long afternoons of shared ordinary labor, I found myself remembering something I'd half forgotten in the panic and grief of the months before. My son had a good heart underneath the shame and the desperation that had briefly made him careless with the people he loved most. It had never been malice that put my life in a stranger's hands. It had been fear and secrecy, a particular kind of loneliness that comes from believing you have to solve your worst problems entirely alone, rather than trusting the people who'd catch you if you just let them. I still had moments, some Sundays sitting alone in that recliner, where the old fear crept back in, some flash of memory from that phone call, the panic in a voice I'd been so certain was Tyler's. But those moments came less often as the weeks went on, replaced slowly by something steadier, something I recognized with some surprise, the beginning of trust being rebuilt. One Saturday, one honest conversation, one shared task at a time. 4 months after that Saturday on the shed roof, we had everyone over for dinner, the first time the whole family had sat down together at my table since this entire ordeal began. Sandra brought a casserole the way she always does for these gatherings. Tyler showed up straight from his shift at the hardware store, still smelling faintly of sawdust. And Corey walked in carrying a toolbox of his own now, a smaller one I'd helped him pick out at the hardware store where Tyler worked, because somewhere in those Saturday mornings together, he'd started asking me to teach him some of what I knew, the way he never had time or interest for when he was younger. He looked different that evening, steadier in a way that had nothing to do with his posture and everything to do with something underneath it. He was 5 months into his recovery program by then, and he'd told me a few weeks earlier, quietly, almost shy about it, that he'd hit a marker they celebrate at his meetings, some number of months without placing a single bet, and that it had felt like the hardest and most honest thing he'd ever accomplished in his life. Sandra told me privately, before dinner, things between them were still healing slower than either of them would like. Healing all the same, built now on a foundation of honesty instead of secrecy that had nearly cost them everything. Tyler had come around too, in his own time. He and his father had a long conversation out on my back porch one evening a couple months back, one I wasn't part of and never asked about, whatever passed between them that night. Seemed to have loosened something that had been sitting tight in Tyler's chest, since he first learned his own nickname had been used as a weapon against the grandfather who'd taught it to him. He still teased his father about it now. Gently, the kind of teasing that only happens once real forgiveness has actually taken root, calling him Ty's dad in a tone that made Corey roll his eyes and smile at the same time. Why? We sat around that table longer than usual that night, the conversation easy in a way it hadn't been in a long while, and at some point, without really planning to, I found myself telling them about a call I'd gotten from Detective Mendez Patel earlier that week. The larger investigation had wrapped up its first round of prosecutions, and 3 people connected to the network that had targeted us were facing real charges now in 3 different states, part of a case big enough that it had apparently drawn some attention from federal investigators looking into similar patterns elsewhere. It wouldn't undo what had happened. It wouldn't hand me back the $5,000 I never got returned, or erase the fear I'd felt standing in that bank line, or the terrible ache of learning my own son's information had been used against me. But it meant something, knowing that what had happened to us had helped stop it from happening to somebody else somewhere down the line, some other frightened grandfather picking up a phone he had every reason to trust. After dinner, once Sandra and Tyler had gone home and the kitchen was quiet again, Corey stayed behind to help me finish up, drying dishes while I washed, the same easy rhythm we'd built over months of Saturday mornings together. He looked over at the old wall phone still hanging above the counter, the one that hadn't rung in years except for the occasional wrong number, and he asked me, half joking, why I still kept it up there when nobody used it anymore. I told him the truth. I told him it reminded me of a time when you knew who was on the other end of a line just by the sound of their voice, when trust didn't require anything more complicated than paying attention to the people you loved. And then I told him something I'd been thinking about for weeks, ever since I'd finally gotten around to replacing my cell phone with one that had caller verification built in, a small technical safeguard that wouldn't have stopped what happened to us, but might slow the next version of it down for somebody else. The world's changed, son. The kind of trust your grandmother and I had in that old phone, it doesn't work the same way anymore. Doesn't mean trust is gone. Just means we have to build it a little more carefully now and maybe check in on it a little more often than we used to. I dried my hands on the towel hanging by the sink and looked at him for a long moment, this grown man who was still, in some essential way, the same boy who used to hand me tools before I even asked. I think that's true for phones, and I think it's true for family too, if I'm honest. You don't get to just assume it'll hold. You have to keep showing up and checking the wiring. Corey nodded slowly, setting the last dish in the rack. For a moment, neither of us said anything else, standing there in a kitchen that had seen 4 decades of this family's ordinary evenings, its arguments and its dinners and its quiet Tuesday nights. Now, carrying one more chapter neither of us would have chosen, but both of us had come through, together in the end. He hugged me before he left that night, the kind of hug we hadn't managed since before all of this started, and I stood in my driveway watching his taillights disappear down the gravel road, feeling something in my chest that had been clenched tight for the better part of a year, finally quietly begin to loosen.